The village of St. Mildred's lay tucked beneath a soft quilt of winter frost, its chimneys breathing thin ribbons of smoke into the pale December sky. Christmas was only 4 days away, and the villagers, fond of tradition and fuss, were already bustling about with wreaths, puddings, and last-minute errands. Even the church bells seemed to ring with a particular crispness, as though eager to announce the coming festivities. On this cold but cheerful morning, the annual Christmas charity bazaar was in full swing inside the parish hall, a rather drafty building whose stone walls had seen centuries of village gossip, quarrels, and celebrations. The air inside shimmered with warmth from the large iron stove, and with the sweet scent of cinnamon biscuits and mulled wine. Tables covered in tartan cloth displayed knitted scarves, homemade jams, and the vicar's famously lopsided fruitcakes, which everyone purchased politely, but nevertheless dreaded receiving. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a sensible grey coat and wearing a hat festooned with a single sprig of holly, stood near the raffle table. She watched the lively hum of activity with the serene curiosity of someone who understood people far better than people suspected. Her blue eyes twinkled as she observed Mrs. Penelope Drury attempting, for the 3rd time, to rearrange the handcrafted ornaments so that her own contributions sat more prominently at the front. "Such a fussy woman," murmured Mrs. Weatherby beside Miss Marple, "always wanting to be noticed." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Some individuals, my dear, do like to feel their efforts are appreciated, especially at Christmas time." Before Mrs. Weatherby could reply, a sudden commotion erupted near the entrance of the hall. The doors burst open, letting in a gust of icy wind, and a flustered young man, Harold Grant, the local postman. His cheeks were flushed, not from the cold, but from the unmistakable look of someone who had seen something dreadful. "Vicar," Harold called, nearly tripping over a stack of hymnals. "Vicar Alderton, sir. You must come at once." The vicar hurried forward, his robes rustling. "What on earth is the matter, Harold? Has something happened?" Harold attempted to steady his breathing. "It's Mrs. Charrington, sir. She's dead." A ripple of shock swept through the hall. Mrs. Eliza Charrington, the wealthy widow who lived in the grand house on Willowcombe Lane, was not well liked in St. Mildred's, but she was certainly well known. Her sharp tongue and formidable opinions were fixtures of village life. "Dead?" gasped Mrs. Weatherby. "But how? She was perfectly fine yesterday, complaining about the state of the postbox, as usual." Harold swallowed. She was found on the doorstep of her house, lying beneath the Christmas wreath. "I didn't see her at first. The wreath had fallen over her face." The room fell silent. Even the stove seemed to crackle more softly. Miss Marple's expression remained composed, though a faint tightening around her eyes signaled her interest. Death, she knew, came to villages in many forms, but rarely did it arrive so dramatically. "Was there anyone else about?" Miss Marple asked gently. Harold shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just her and that wreath. I knocked for nearly a minute before I realized something was wrong." Vicar Alderton placed a steadying hand on the young man's shoulder. "We must inform Inspector Denham. Harold, go at once." As Harold dashed out again, murmurs erupted across the hall, like bees stirred from a hive. "Heart attack, no doubt," muttered Mr. Wilton, the fishmonger. "Or she slipped on the ice," suggested Mrs. Drury. "Or perhaps," whispered Mrs. Weatherby with wide eyes, "someone helped her slip." Miss Marple did not add to the speculation. She merely observed, watching the way people reacted, the patterns emerging, the nervous glances exchanged. Human nature, she believed, was remarkably consistent, even wrapped in tinsel and Christmas cheer. The vicar, his face pale, appealed to the crowd for calm. "Please continue with the bazaar. The inspector will sort everything out. Let us not jump to conclusions." But gossip had already sprouted like weeds, Miss Marple, however, quietly walked toward the door, fastening her gloves. She had no intention of interfering, at least not yet, but she felt compelled to see the scene herself, if only to satisfy her curiosity. Outside, the air bit sharply at her cheeks. St. Mildred's looked deceptively peaceful. Cottages trimmed with garlands, lanterns glowing softly in windows, and faint carols drifting from the church choir rehearsal. Yet beneath the festive surface, something colder than winter frost had settled. Mrs. Charrington's house stood only a few minutes away. Miss Marple made her way along the narrow lane, her footsteps crunching lightly through the thin layer of snow. When she arrived, she found Inspector Lionel Denham already there, tall, stiff, and looking more annoyed than alarmed. "Miss Marple," he said with a sigh. "I should have guessed. I simply happened to pass by," she said pleasantly. "One must walk after sitting so long in a warm hall." Inspector Denham did not argue. He stepped aside, allowing her a view of the scene. Mrs. Charrington lay on her doorstep, her fur coat dusted with snowflakes. The large, elaborate Christmas wreath, made of pine, holly, and silver ribbon, rested slightly askew beside her. Her eyes were closed, her expression oddly peaceful. Natural causes, most likely, Denham said. She was 79. Miss Marple studied the body quietly. Perhaps, though her gloves seem rather damp, don't they? Almost as though she had been handling something wet shortly before she fell. Denham frowned. "You have the sharpest eyes in all of England." "Oh, not at all," Miss Marple replied. "One simply notices things when one has seen a great deal of life." As the inspector returned to his notes, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the wreath, its lower edge slightly crushed, as though someone had stepped upon it. And somewhere deep within her, a quiet certainty took root. Whatever had happened here on this cold December morning, it was no accident. The truth, she felt, was waiting quite near. By the next morning, the news had spread through St. Mildred's like fire through dry hay. Mrs. Eliza Charrington, wealthy widow, formidable hostess, and veteran of every parish committee since 1932, was dead, and not merely dead, but found lifeless upon her own doorstep. Beneath her grand Christmas wreath of pine and holly, every teapot in the village rattled with speculation. At the Blue Finch tea room, Mrs. Penelope Drury held court as though she were the editor of the Times. "Well, I said to her only last week that her steps were dangerous when icy," she declared, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigor. But of course, she never listened to anyone, always thought she knew better than the rest of us. Across from her, Mrs. Weatherby leaned in conspiratorially. "Do you truly think it was a fall, then?" Mrs. Drury hesitated. "Well, the inspector seems to think so, but I don't know. Poor Harold Grant said she looked, well, rather placed, if you ask me, like someone had arranged her." That remark earned a scandalized gasp from Mrs. Beeton, who was buttering a scone. "Placed? Penelope, really? It's Christmas. One shouldn't say such morbid things." But the damage was done. The seed of suspicion had been planted, and in St. Mildred's fertile soil of gossip, such seeds flourished quickly. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat quietly at her usual corner table, knitting a length of pale blue wool with rhythmic precision. She did not intrude on the chatter, though she heard every word. To her, the talk of the village was like birdsong, noisy, repetitive, but always revealing patterns to the patient ear. She thought of Mrs. Charrington's expression when she saw her the previous day. Calm, almost serene. There had been no sign of a struggle, no marks, no weapon. Yet the damp gloves still puzzled her. What had the woman been doing outside? Gloved and alone, so near to twilight, on such a freezing evening. Miss Marple looked up as the tea-room door opened, letting in a gust of cold air and a flurry of snow. Inspector Denham entered, brushing frost from his coat. He gave a curt nod to the women, who immediately lowered their voices and pretended to be discussing mince pies, and ordered a cup of tea. He spotted Miss Marple and sighed. "I might have known I'd find you here, Miss Marple, the nerve center of the entire investigation." "Hardly that, Inspector," she replied mildly. "One does enjoy a nice scone now and then. Do sit down. I won't keep you." He hesitated, then joined her. The warmth and smell of cinnamon softened his expression a little. "I suppose you've heard everything there is to hear already." "Oh, only what people are willing to say aloud," Miss Marple said, "which is quite different from what they're thinking." Denham smiled wearily. "You sound like my wife." She chuckled softly. "A good sign of intelligence, I'm sure." He took a sip of tea. "For the record, it does appear to have been an accident. The doctor confirmed she died of a blow to the head, likely from the fall. No evidence of foul play. Still, I'll have the coroner take a closer look." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking quietly. "And the wreath?" "Ordinary enough. Heavy thing, though. Lots of pine cones, metal wire in the frame. Could have fallen with her?" Miss Marple pursed her lips. "I suppose it might have. Yet one wonders why it was on the ground under her, rather than beside her." Denham frowned. "You think someone moved it?" "I think," she said gently, "that people often tidy things, even when they oughtn't. Someone may have tried to make the scene look proper." The inspector gave a short laugh. "In this village that sounds entirely possible." Before he could say more, Mrs. Weatherby's voice rose again. "You know, she was seen arguing with someone only the day before." All eyes turned. "Arguing?" repeated Mrs. Drury eagerly. "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Weatherby, lowering her voice to a stage whisper. "Mrs. Pettigrew saw her in the churchyard with that new lodger at Hilltop Cottage, Mr. Simon Trent. He's an artist, apparently. Rather handsome, but terribly private." Denham's brows lifted. "Trent, you say?" Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. She remembered the young man, dark-haired, polite, always carrying sketchbooks. He had moved to St. Mildred's in early autumn, saying he sought peace and quiet for his painting. In her experience, people who sought peace were often fleeing from something far less tranquil. "Yes, him," said Mrs. Weatherby. Mrs. Pettigrew swore she heard raised voices, something about money or a painting. But of course, Mrs. Pettigrew is hard of hearing, so one mustn't rely too heavily. Inspector Denham rose abruptly. "Thank you, ladies. That'll be all." When he left, the tea-room buzzed anew with fresh speculation. Miss Marple finished her tea and quietly followed a few minutes later. The snow had thickened, settling in soft white layers upon rooftops and hedgerows. Her path took her past Willowcombe Lane, where Mrs. Charrington's grand house still stood sealed with police tape, then farther on, up the hill, to Hilltop Cottage, a small stone dwelling with smoke curling from its chimney. Mr. Simon Trent answered her knock, surprise flickering across his face. "Miss Marple, isn't it? What a pleasure." She smiled kindly. "I do hope I'm not disturbing your work. I was merely out walking and thought I might call to see how you're settling in. Such dreadful news about Mrs. Charrington." He stepped aside awkwardly. "Yes, terrible business. Please, come in." The cottage was neat, but sparse. An easel stood near the window, and the scent of turpentine mingled with that of pine logs burning in the hearth. On a nearby table, half-finished sketches lay scattered, landscapes, portraits, one rather striking study of an elderly woman's hands. "You knew Mrs. Charrington, then?" Miss Marple asked gently. He hesitated, pouring tea into mismatched cups. "Slightly. She commissioned a portrait, said she wanted something to leave to her nephew. We were discussing it last week, but she'd been, well, rather difficult. She changed her mind about the pose 3 times. Miss Marple's gaze rested briefly on a canvas turned to face the wall. A perfectionist, perhaps? He smiled wryly. That's one word for it. She sipped her tea, her tone light. I hear there was some disagreement between you two. His eyes flickered. Village gossip travels faster than paint dries, doesn't it? It was nothing. She complained about the price. I reminded her that time and materials cost money. Quite right, Miss Marple said, and she was not the sort to pay more than she must. He laughed softly. You knew her well, then, in a manner of speaking. St. Mildred's is not large. One learns people's habits. When she rose to leave, she paused at the door. One last thing, Mr. Trent. Did she mention what became of the portrait? He hesitated again, just long enough for her to notice. She said she wished to think about it. I still have it here, unfinished. Miss Marple's smile did not waver, but her mind was already whirring. She thanked him warmly and stepped back into the cold. As she walked home, through the softly falling snow, one thought lingered. In every village crime, beneath the chatter and the kindness, there lay something quite human: envy, pride, resentment. And somewhere behind Mrs. Charrington's wreath of holly and silver ribbon, one of those human flaws had blossomed into murder. Inspector Denham had not slept well. By the following morning, his temper was as short as the daylight. The official report from the coroner had arrived early. No sign of natural causes, as he had half hoped. Mrs. Eliza Charrington's death had been the result of blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. No evidence of a struggle, no defensive wounds, and no theft. The blow had likely been delivered by something heavy and rounded, perhaps from behind. In other words, murder. He sat in his small office above the post office, surrounded by half-drunk cups of tea and the faint scent of damp wool. Through the frosted window he could see the rooftops of St. Mildred's, white with snow and deceptively tranquil. Murder always seemed to strike here when the village was at its most picturesque. Blast it, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. Why couldn't she just have fallen? Outside, the church bell struck 10. A knock came at his door. Come in. Harold Grant, the postman, entered nervously, clutching his cap. You wanted to see me, sir? Yes, Grant. Sit down. You found the body, didn't you? Yes, sir. Walk me through it again. Slowly this time. Harold swallowed hard. Well, sir, it was just after 8 in the morning. I was making deliveries. Mostly Christmas cards, you know. And I came to Mrs. Charrington's gate. The house looked quiet. No smoke from the chimney yet. But that's not unusual. She liked her breakfast late. I rang the bell. No answer. Then I saw something odd. A bit of the wreath lying on the step. I thought it had blown down, so I bent to pick it up, and that's when I saw her. Denham nodded, taking notes. And you didn't see anyone else nearby? No, sir. The lane was empty. But what? Harold fidgeted. Well, as I came up the path, I did notice footprints in the snow. Not mine. They were already there. Looked like a man's boots. Only one set, going up to the doorstep. Denham looked up sharply. And not coming back down? Harold shook his head. No, sir. Not that I could see. Denham leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his teeth. Right. That's something. When Harold left, Denham rubbed his chin thoughtfully. One set of footprints, up to the doorstep, none returning. That was the sort of detail that could unravel everything. By midday, the inspector made his way to Hilltop Cottage. The snow had stopped, but the air bit cruelly. Simon Trent answered the door again, this time wearing a paint-streaked apron and a weary expression. Inspector, he said cautiously. Back so soon? I just have a few questions, Mr. Trent. Routine. Inside, the fire burned low. Denham's eyes flicked around the cottage, noting the sketches, the stacked canvases, and the faint metallic scent of paint and turpentine. You said you argued with Mrs. Charrington about money. Trent nodded. Yes. She'd agreed to pay £15 for the portrait, then decided 10 was more reasonable. I told her politely that art supplies are expensive. We parted civilly enough. Was that your last meeting? The young man hesitated a fraction too long. Yes, I believe so. You believe? Trent gave a nervous laugh. Forgive me. The days blur together when one's working. I may have seen her passing in the lane once after that, but we didn't speak. Denham eyed him closely. And where were you between 6 and 9 on the morning of the 12th? Here, Trent said immediately. Painting. I usually start early, before the light fades. Can anyone confirm that? No, he admitted. I live alone. Denham sighed. Convenient. Trent's jaw tightened. Are you accusing me, Inspector? Not yet, Denham said mildly, but I'll need you to stay in the village until further notice. As he left the cottage, Denham noticed something peculiar in the snow by the doorstep. A faint streak of red, too bright to be rust, and too fresh to be paint. He crouched down, scraping the snow gently with his glove. A small smear, paint most likely given the artist's work, but still, it made him pause. He took out his notebook and jotted a line. Red mark, outside Hilltop Cottage. Possibly paint, possibly blood. Back in the heart of the village, Miss Marple was enjoying a quiet luncheon with Mrs. Weatherby. Or rather, Miss Marple was enjoying it. Mrs. Weatherby was talking far too quickly to eat. I tell you, Jane, this business has unsettled everyone. They say the inspector's been up to Hilltop Cottage twice already, and Mrs. Pettigrew insists she saw a light in Mrs. Charrington's house late that night. 10:30, maybe later. What would the poor woman be doing awake at that hour? Miss Marple smiled gently, stirring her tea, perhaps waiting for someone, or worrying about something. Oh, you think so? Mrs. Weatherby leaned in eagerly. And who might that someone be? I couldn't say, Miss Marple replied lightly. But I do recall Mrs. Charrington's maid, young Molly, isn't it? Mentioning that her mistress was expecting a visitor that evening. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes grew wide. You don't mean— I don't mean anything, my dear, Miss Marple interrupted with her usual calm. I merely remember details. People often forget them until they prove useful. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk toward the Charrington estate. The police had gone, leaving only a single constable at the gate. He recognized her and nodded politely, too well aware that resistance was futile against Miss Marple's gentle determination. She stood for a long while gazing at the steps. The wreath had been removed, though a faint circular impression in the snow still marked where it had lain. She bent carefully, peering at the stone. A faint residue of something sticky, sap, perhaps, or resin, and near it, the tiniest fragment of silver ribbon, caught between two cobbles. She tucked it into her glove. Tidy people often leave untidy truths, she murmured to herself. As she turned to leave, a movement caught her eye. A figure at the upstairs window. It was Molly, the maid, her face pale and frightened. When their eyes met, the girl disappeared behind the curtain. Miss Marple hesitated. Then she approached the door and knocked. After a moment, Molly answered, wringing her hands. Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't think— well, I wasn't supposed to let anyone in. My dear, I only wish to speak a moment, Miss Marple said kindly. You must be terribly shaken. The girl nodded, tears brimming. It's horrid, ma'am. She was so difficult sometimes, but she didn't deserve this. Of course not, Miss Marple said. Tell me, my dear, was she expecting someone that evening? Molly hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. Yes, ma'am. A gentleman. She didn't say who, just that he was coming to settle a matter before Christmas. And did you see him arrive? The girl shook her head. No, ma'am. I went to bed around 10. But I did hear voices downstairs later. Men's voices, quiet but sharp, if you understand me. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, my dear, I understand perfectly. When she left the house, dusk was falling, and the first stars trembled above the village rooftops. Somewhere, a carol drifted faintly through the air. God rest ye merry gentlemen. But Miss Marple's thoughts were not merry. A visitor after dark, a wreath on the ground, a pair of footprints leading only one way, and behind it all, the unmistakable scent of human deceit, old as Christmas itself, and just as carefully wrapped. Inspector Denham's office smelled faintly of coal smoke and frustration. The morning light slanted through the frosted panes, scattering across stacks of reports and the cluttered surface of his desk. He sat with his sleeves rolled up, a pencil wedged behind one ear, staring at the coroner's final notes for what must have been the 10th time. Blunt force trauma to the occipital region. Estimated time of death between 9:30 and 11 p.m. No signs of forced entry. No defensive wounds. In plain English, Mrs. Eliza Charrington had likely known her killer. The inspector sighed heavily. So it wasn't an accident after all. And of course, everyone in St. Mildred's has a theory. He looked up as Sergeant Cole, a square-shouldered man with an amiable expression, entered, carrying a folder. "Morning, sir. I've got the statements you asked for. You'll love this. Half the village claims they heard or saw something that night, and not one account matches the other." "Typical," Denham muttered. "Let's have it." Cole laid the folder on the desk and flipped it open. First, Mrs. Pettigrew says she saw Mrs. Charrington alive at 9:30, arguing with a man near her gate. She couldn't see his face clearly because of the fog, but she says he wore a dark coat and a hat. Denham frowned. "That fits our artist friend, Mr. Simon Trent, doesn't it? Always wears that blasted black coat." Cole nodded. "Yes, sir. But then there's Mr. Wilton, the fishmonger. He says he saw Trent locking up his cottage around the same time. Claims he passed him on the lane while heading home from the pub. So either Mrs. Pettigrew's eyes are playing tricks, or Mr. Wilton's memory is pickled in gin." Denham said dryly. "What about the maid, Molly?" Cole turned a page. "She sticks to her story. She went to bed just after 10, heard voices downstairs a bit later, male voices. Says one sounded angry, then the front door slammed. She thought nothing more of it until morning." Denham tapped his pencil against the desk. Voices after 10, time of death between 9:30 and 11. It fits neatly enough, and Trent has no alibi. "Would you like me to bring him in, sir?" The inspector nodded grimly. "Yes, but quietly. Let's not feed the hens more gossip than necessary." By mid-afternoon, Simon Trent sat in the small interview room above the post office. His dark eyes were defiant but nervous, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Denham regarded him evenly. "Mr. Trent, you told me you hadn't seen Mrs. Charrington since your disagreement over the portrait." "That's right. Yet we have a witness who claims to have seen you at her gate that very evening." Trent's jaw tightened. "A witness? Who?" "I can't disclose that, but would you like to amend your statement?" Trent hesitated, then sighed. "All right. I did see her that night. She sent me a note, delivered by young Molly, asking me to come by to discuss the painting. I thought she'd changed her mind about the price." "What time was this?" "About 9:30. I arrived at the house just before 10. And then?" She seemed nervous. Not her usual self at all. Said she wanted to pay me in cash, but she'd misplaced her purse. Asked me to wait while she fetched it. When she came back, she said something about her nephew arriving from London soon, and how the portrait might be worth more than she'd thought. Denham frowned. "Did you argue?" "No, she gave me £10 in the end. I left. At what time?" "Just after 10. I remember because the church bell chimed as I stepped outside." "And you saw no one else on the way home?" "No one." Denham leaned back in his chair. "The maid says she heard angry voices and a door slam around that same time." Trent's expression hardened. Then she's mistaken. I didn't raise my voice. I'm not a fool, Inspector. I know how that would look. The inspector studied him silently for several moments. There was something about Trent's composure, just too careful, too measured. One last thing, Denham said. What became of the portrait? Trent hesitated. It's still in my cottage, unfinished. I'd like to see it. Trent looked uneasy, but nodded. Half an hour later, Denham stood before the portrait. It rested on an easel near the window, bathed in pale winter light. Mrs. Charrington's likeness stared back at him. Sharp eyes, proud chin, every line of her face rendered with unflattering accuracy. It was the sort of painting that revealed its subject rather than flattered them. She didn't like it, I imagine, Denham remarked. Trent gave a short laugh. She said it made her look like a vulture. I told her that depended on one's opinion of vultures. The inspector crouched, examining the edge of the canvas where a faint smudge of dried red paint lingered. What color is this? Crimson Lake, Trent said. A favorite of hers. She insisted her dress be that shade. Denham straightened. We found a small red mark outside your cottage. Same color, perhaps. Paint, no doubt. I rinse my brushes out there sometimes. The inspector didn't reply, but he made a note. Then he glanced around the room and noticed something curious. An empty hook on the wall, dustless compared to its surroundings. What hung here? He asked. Trent looked startled. Oh, that? A wreath. Mrs. Charrington gave it to me when I delivered her portrait sketches. Said it was too large for her door, and she hated waste. I took it down after the news broke, of course. Felt inappropriate. Denham's eyes narrowed. You had a wreath from her house? Yes. I threw it out the morning after her death. The inspector's silence was heavy. Where? The rubbish bin behind the cottage. But by now, well, the dustman came yesterday. Denham's pencil paused mid-note. Pity. That evening, word of Trent's questioning spread through the village like wildfire. By supper time, half of St. Mildred's had decided he was guilty, and the other half swore he was being framed. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat by her fire, a cup of tea in hand, and her knitting in her lap. She had listened carefully to the whispers at the grocer's and the butcher's, and found them as revealing as any confession. Simon Trent could have done it. He had opportunity, and perhaps motive, but something about the neatness of it troubled her. Life, in Miss Marple's long experience, rarely arranged itself so tidily. She rose, fetched her notebook, and began jotting observations in her delicate hand. Footprints to the door, none returning. Red mark near cottage, paint or blood. Maid heard two voices, angry, then door slam. Time of death. Between 9:30 and 11 p.m., Trent admits visit at 10 Jew. Wreath connection. Then she added one more line beneath them, almost as an afterthought. Mrs. Charrington's nephew. Expected from London. She remembered the name vaguely from one of the woman's endless conversations at the Women's Institute. Edward Charrington. Young, charming, something in finance, whatever that meant. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Murder investigations, she knew, were like knitting. If one pulled at the wrong thread, the whole pattern unraveled. But if one found the right thread, her fire popped softly, and the clock struck 9. Outside, the snow fell again, gentle and silent, covering every footprint, every trace of what had happened beneath that Christmas wreath. And Miss Marple knew, before long, something would disturb that snow once more. The next morning dawned pale and still, the frost clinging to the hedgerows like lace. St. Mary Mead was quiet, but the quiet was of a different kind now. A watchful silence, full of whispers behind curtains and eyes that followed every constable who passed. The death of Henry Barstow had unsettled the village like a tremor beneath its cobbled surface. At the vicarage, Mrs. Bantry was already in the throes of excitement when Miss Marple arrived for tea. The sitting room was warm, the scent of pine and buttered scones mingling in the air. "My dear Jane, you simply must hear the latest," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, waving a newspaper clipping like a battle flag. "They say the police have found traces of poison in Mr. Barstow's teacup." "Poison? Just think of it, right under our noses, and at Christmas." Miss Marple, seated neatly with her gloved hands in her lap, gave a gentle nod. "Ah, yes, poison. Such a cowardly weapon, don't you think? But often used by those who feel cornered." Mrs. Bantry blinked. Cornered? Oh, but Henry Barstow was the one doing the cornering, if gossip is to be believed. The poor man was insufferable, to be sure, but hardly anyone would risk the noose for him. Miss Marple smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the steam curling from her teacup. "Oh, my dear Dolly, one finds that sometimes the mildest persons, those who could not bear to raise their voice, can commit shocking acts, given sufficient pressure. Why, I once knew a dear lady in Much Benham who poisoned her husband for leaving the teapot uncovered at breakfast. A matter of principle, she called it." Mrs. Bantry gasped, delighted and horrified. "You can't mean it." But Miss Marple merely stirred her tea, eyes thoughtful. By afternoon she was walking back through the high street, her mind turning over the facts in gentle order. The gossip had already hardened into something like local truth, that Mr. Barstow had been murdered by someone in the room that night. The police suspected Geraldine Turner, the local organist, who had served the tea and had been visibly trembling ever since. But Miss Marple thought otherwise. Trembling, after all, could mean guilt, or fear of something else entirely. As she passed the green, she caught sight of young Elsie Brent, the housemaid from Barstow's cottage, hanging laundry in the cold air. Miss Marple stopped, her tone cheerful. "Good afternoon, my dear. Such a task for a frosty day. I do hope you're well after the excitement." Elsie blushed. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's been dreadful, it has. The police in and out, asking questions, touching things. I don't hardly know what to do for nerves." "I expect so," Miss Marple said kindly. "Such a shock to lose one's employer in so tragic a way. Tell me, did you happen to notice whether Mr. Barstow was himself that evening? Sometimes a person looks a trifle different when something's troubling them." Elsie hesitated. "He did seem strange, now that you mention it. Quiet-like. He'd been writing in that little black notebook of his all day, then put it in his desk drawer. Locked it up, he did. Wouldn't let me dust in there after that." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How very interesting, my dear. And what became of the notebook, do you know?" Elsie bit her lip. "Well, that's the funny part, miss. It's gone. The police searched, but there's no sign of it." Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost absent-minded. "A vanished notebook. Yes, those things do have a way of walking off when they're most inconvenient." Later that evening, in the comfort of her own parlor, Miss Marple laid out the facts as she knew them. A poison in the tea, likely cyanide, for its quick and certain action. A room full of witnesses, and yet only one had handled the teapot directly. Miss Turner. But the manner of death, the vanishing notebook, and the curious look of satisfaction that had crossed Barstow's face before he fell. Those details did not fit with an impulsive act of fear. No, Miss Marple thought. This had been deliberate. Clever. She took up her knitting needles and clicked them thoughtfully. People often revealed more than they intended, especially when they thought themselves clever. And she remembered distinctly that Mr. Barstow had made a little speech before the toast, something about truth always coming out in the end. A remark that had made several faces in the room go pale. particularly Mrs. Pemberley, who'd been standing by the Christmas wreath at the time. Mrs. Pemberley, a woman known for her composure, her grace. And yet, Miss Marple recalled the faint tremor in her voice, the way her eyes darted toward the teapot, as though something in it held the weight of doom. She rose, crossed the room, and opened a small writing desk. Inside was a modest pile of letters, old Christmas cards and correspondence from friends. But it was not the letters she sought. It was a small scrap of ribbon she had found the previous evening near the Barstows' front door, a narrow strip of red satin, frayed slightly at one end. Now that she examined it in the lamplight, she noticed something curious. A faint powdery residue clung to the edge, a glittering dust that might have been sugar, or something else entirely. She touched it lightly, frowned, and set it aside. "Ribbon," she murmured. From the wreath, perhaps, or a gift wrapping. But why so near the door? A knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Inspector Craddock, his overcoat dusted with frost. "Evening, Miss Marple. Thought I'd best stop by. We've confirmed it was cyanide, in the sugar, not the tea itself." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "The sugar?" "Yes, 1 lump, poisoned. Seems Mr. Barstow always took 2. Miss Turner dropped them in for him." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "but perhaps she didn't choose the lumps herself." Craddock frowned. "Meaning?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Meaning, Inspector, that one must never assume the hand that serves the tea is the same that prepared it." The inspector gave a sigh. "You've got one of your feelings again, haven't you?" Miss Marple chuckled lightly. "Just a thought, dear Inspector. A thought and a ribbon." When he left, she sat back down and picked up her knitting once more. The needles clicked in steady rhythm as her mind traced invisible connections. A vanished notebook, a poisoned sugar lump, a ribbon with a dusting of crystalline powder. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's tolled 8 o'clock, their echoes floating over the snow. Inside, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. She had found her clue. Not the kind that shone brightly under a detective's lamp, but a whisper, a thread. And she knew, as surely as she knew the pattern of her knitting, that someone in St. Mary Mead had tied that ribbon with care and with murder in mind. By the following afternoon, St. Mary Mead was steeped in its favorite pastime, gossip disguised as concern. At the Greenfinch grocer's, in the post office, and even in the churchyard, the talk was of nothing but Henry Barstow and his poisoned tea. Theories multiplied like ivy, some outlandish, others disturbingly plausible. Miss Marple, moving unobtrusively through it all, listened with mild curiosity. She had long understood that gossip, properly filtered, was the truest mirror of a village's heart. People lied with words, yes, but rarely with emotion. Fear, envy, guilt, they all left traces in tone and gesture. At the grocer's, Mrs. Hartwell leaned close to Mrs. Price Ridley and whispered, "I tell you, it was Mrs. Pemberley. You mark my words." There was something in her eyes that night, hard as flint. And why did she faint when she heard about the poison? "Because she's delicate," sniffed Mrs. Price Ridley. "A fainting fit does not make one a murderess." Miss Marple, who stood just behind them, smiled faintly as she examined the apples in her basket. "Fainting, dear Mrs. Price Ridley, can mean so many things," she said mildly. "Sometimes guilt, sometimes fear, but most often relief." Both women turned toward her, startled. "Relief? Oh, yes," Miss Marple continued, turning an apple thoughtfully in her hand. "When one has been dreading something dreadful, and then it happens, not as one feared, but differently, it can be quite liberating." She paid for her purchases, leaving them gaping behind her. By evening, she found herself at the Pemberley residence. The house, ivy-covered and genteel, stood at the edge of the village, its windows aglow with lamplight. Mrs. Pemberley herself answered the door, pale, elegant, her expression taut like fine china about to crack. "Miss Marple," she said with forced warmth, "how good of you to call. Do come in. I dare say we could both use a bit of company." Inside, the drawing-room was fragrant with hyacinths and faintly scented candles. A half-finished wreath lay upon the table, its ribbon tails draping across the polished surface. "I've been making a new Christmas wreath," Mrs. Pemberley said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "After what happened at the Hall, I could hardly bear to look at the old one." Miss Marple glanced at it quietly. "Yes, quite understandable. Such associations cling to things, don't they? Though sometimes, my dear, they cling to people as well." Mrs. Pemberley's fingers faltered on the ribbon. "You mean gossip, of course. I've heard what they say, that I had some quarrel with Henry Barstow over that ghastly investment of his." "Not gossip, precisely," Miss Marple said softly, "but there's often truth at the heart of gossip, if one knows where to look." Mrs. Pemberley drew herself up. "Mr. Barstow was a bully and a blackmailer. I have nothing to hide from you, Miss Marple. He threatened me, said he would reveal my husband's debts, ruin our name if I didn't repay what he'd lost. It was vile, indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze steady. "That must have been difficult. Yet you continued to speak with him that evening?" "I had no choice. Appearances, you understand." Miss Marple nodded. "Appearances are everything in a village such as ours. One learns to keep one's face composed, no matter the storm underneath." A silence stretched between them. The clock ticked. Then Mrs. Pemberley's composure cracked, her voice trembling. "Do you think I killed him, Miss Marple?" The old lady regarded her with kind, unflinching eyes. "No, my dear. I think you feared that he would die. There's a great difference between fear and intent." Tears welled up, unbidden, and Mrs. Pemberley turned away. "He said he had evidence, something in writing. He kept a notebook, but it's gone now. Perhaps the person who killed him took it." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Perhaps, but often such things are destroyed by those who fear what they might reveal." Later that night, Miss Marple met Inspector Craddock once more at the Blue Boar Inn. The publican's daughter had set out 2 cups of steaming cocoa, and Craddock was poring over a notebook of his own. "Evening, ma'am," he said gruffly. "We've got more complications. Turns out Barstow wasn't short of enemies. Half the village owed him money, and the other half despised him for his schemes." Miss Marple sipped her cocoa, eyes on the rising steam. "Yes, money is an excellent motive, though rarely the whole story. Tell me, Inspector, did you ever discover who prepared the tea service that evening?" "Mrs. Turner, the organist. She set the tray before the guests arrived. And the sugar bowl?" He frowned. "Was already filled. She said she took it from the kitchen cupboard." "Ah, and who last used the cupboard?" Craddock looked puzzled. "The housemaid, Elsie Brent, according to her statement. She cleaned up after dinner." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. "Interesting. Poor Elsie seemed genuinely frightened when I saw her yesterday. I wonder if she fears something more than the police." "You think she's hiding something?" "Oh, undoubtedly," Miss Marple said calmly. "But not guilt, Inspector. Fear. Fear of someone she's loyal to or indebted to." Craddock groaned. "You do make things complicated, Miss Marple." "Not at all," she replied sweetly. "Human nature is simple, really. People act from habit, fear, or love. The trick is to see which of the 3 fits the pattern." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's door. Geraldine Turner herself. She looked pale, her eyes swollen as if from sleepless nights. "Miss Marple, I don't know where else to turn, she said in a low voice. They think I did it, that I poisoned Henry Barstow, but I swear to you, I never touched that sugar bowl except to serve it. Miss Marple motioned her in, offering a seat by the fire. My dear, you mustn't upset yourself so. Tell me everything, calmly and from the beginning. Geraldine clasped her hands tightly. It was chaos that evening. Mrs. Pemberley asked me to help fetch the tea. I set the tray, but the sugar bowl was already there, covered with a napkin. She said not to fuss with it. It was freshly filled. I thought nothing of it then. But now, she shivered. Now I see what it means. Miss Marple's eyes were kind. Did you notice anything unusual about Mrs. Pemberley's behavior afterward? She seemed nervous. But then again, so was everyone. When Mr. Barstow fell, she screamed and fainted. I thought she was frightened, but fainting can mean many things, Miss Marple said softly. I quite agree. She rose, walked to her writing desk, and withdrew the small scrap of ribbon. Tell me, Miss Turner, does this look familiar? Geraldine's eyes widened. Yes, that's the ribbon from the first Christmas wreath at the hall. Mrs. Pemberley tied it herself. Miss Marple smiled gently. So I thought. When Geraldine had gone, Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the snow drift down over the garden. The pieces were aligning now, slowly, delicately. A poisoned sugar lump, a vanished notebook, a ribbon, tainted with residue. But most telling of all was the pattern of fear. Who feared whom and why? Henry Barstow had known too much. Someone had silenced him, not out of greed, but desperation, and Miss Marple, gazing into the whiteness, knew that the wreath, the ribbon, and the fainting fit were all tied together in one quiet, deadly knot. It was time, she thought, to pull the thread. The following morning dawned bright and brittle. Frost glittered on every roof tile of St. Mary Mead, and smoke curled lazily from chimneys into a pale winter sky. The village might have looked peaceful again, but beneath its pretty surface, something darker churned. Fear, suspicion, the low hum of unease. At 11 o'clock sharp, a commotion broke the morning calm. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed along the high street, followed by the sight of Constable Wilson rushing from the direction of Barstow's cottage, his breath puffing in white clouds. Another death, cried Mrs. Price Ridley, who happened to be conveniently positioned near her front gate. Within minutes, word had spread like wildfire. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived at the scene, half the village was already whispering outside the garden fence. Inside the cottage, the scene was eerily familiar. Geraldine Turner, the organist and recent prime suspect, lay slumped across the kitchen table. A half-empty cup of cocoa sat beside her, the rim stained with traces of white. Poison, muttered Craddock grimly. Same as before. Cyanide. He turned sharply as Miss Marple entered, escorted by a nervous constable. Miss Marple, for heaven's sake, how do you always appear when something's amiss? She smiled faintly. I happened to be passing, Inspector, and one must never ignore a crowd gathering before noon. It nearly always means trouble. Craddock sighed, rubbing his temple. So now we've two victims. Either she took her own life out of guilt, or the killer's tying up loose ends. Miss Marple's gentle eyes swept the room. The cocoa tin on the shelf, the milk jug, still half full, the faintly ajar window letting in a current of icy air. She stepped closer to the table, her gaze thoughtful. Do you see, Inspector, the cup? She asked quietly. The cocoa's only half drunk. If Miss Turner meant to take her life, she'd hardly stop midway. Poisoners, dear Inspector, are seldom half-hearted. Craddock frowned. So you're suggesting someone slipped in here and poisoned her cocoa? Miss Marple touched the handle of the cup lightly, careful not to disturb it. Oh no, I suspect it was prepared for her, with great care. and given under the guise of kindness. She turned toward the doorway, where Elsie Brent hovered uncertainly, wringing her apron. "My dear, did you happen to bring Miss Turner any refreshments this morning?" Elsie's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, Miss Marple. I was asked to. Mrs. Pemberley said the poor lady looked dreadful and could do with something warm." Miss Marple's knitting-bag fingers tightened imperceptibly. "I see. And did Mrs. Pemberley give you the cocoa tin herself?" Elsie nodded miserably. "She did. Said it was her own special blend, from a tin she keeps for guests. I just added milk and sugar, like always." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Always." By noon the village was aflame with theories once more. Some whispered that Geraldine had killed herself out of remorse. Others swore she had been silenced. The talk grew so wild that the vicar postponed choir practice, fearing that half his parishioners might faint from scandal. Miss Marple, however, took a quiet seat by her window with a small notebook of her own. She jotted down a few lines in her delicate script. Barstow, blackmailer. Notebook vanished. Mrs. Pemberley, fear, not greed. Ribbon, powdered with residue, cyanide. Geraldine Turner, dead, poisoned by cocoa prepared by Mrs. Pemberley. She paused, pen hovering. Then she added, "Why sugar again?" It was a curious pattern, she thought. Cyanide disguised in sweetness, first in tea, now in cocoa. The sort of detail one might overlook unless one understood human nature. For some killers, method was more than practicality. It was poetry. She rose, wrapped her shawl about her shoulders, and made her way to the late Henry Barstow's cottage. Inspector Craddock met her at the gate, looking harassed. "I can't make sense of it, Miss Marple," he admitted. "Every lead goes nowhere. Mrs. Pemberley looks worse by the hour, but she denies everything. We found nothing in her home but ribbons and letters." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ribbons, dear Inspector, can be most revealing things. Did you happen to look at her hands?" "Her hands?" "Yes. A woman who handles chemicals, cleaning agents, for instance, often shows traces on the nails. Cyanide leaves a faint discoloration, if one knows to look." He blinked. "You think she's guilty, then?" Miss Marple smiled. "I think she's frightened. Guilt makes one defensive, Inspector. Fear makes one kind." She nodded toward the cottage door. "Might I step inside a moment?" Craddock gestured wearily. "By all means. I'd be a fool to stop you." Here the kitchen was still as a held breath. Miss Marple moved with the delicate precision of someone used to observing the overlooked. She studied the cocoa tin, the sugar bowl beside it, the faint glint of powder in the creases of the tablecloth. Then her eyes fell on something small near the hearth, a fragment of paper, crumpled and half-burned. She bent down and retrieved it with the tip of her crochet hook. The ink was blurred, but a few words were still legible. Proof of debt. Return before Christmas Eve. Notebook? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She turned toward the window where the faintest breeze stirred the curtains. Snowlight glimmered on the sill, and there, barely visible, another clue. A tiny trace of the same glittering dust she had seen on the ribbon. Cyanide crystals, almost invisible, carried by careless fingers. She replaced the scrap of paper in her handbag and turned to Craddock. "The notebook is the key, you see. Someone feared what was written within it, someone he had threatened to expose." Craddock's eyes widened. But if it was Mrs. Pemberley, why kill Miss Turner? "Because Miss Turner knew," Miss Marple said softly. "She handled the tray that night. She may have seen something, or someone, tampering with the sugar bowl before the party. A frightened conscience will silence any witness, Inspector, especially one with kind eyes." Craddock slammed his notebook shut. "Then it's time we spoke to Mrs. Pemberley again." When they arrived at the Pemberley home, the lady herself was sitting by the fire, her face ghostly pale against the flickering light. On the table beside her lay a fresh wreath, white roses this time, not red, and a cup of tea untouched. Miss Marple stepped forward gently. "My dear Mrs. Pemberley, I'm afraid I bring distressing news. Miss Turner has died." Mrs. Pemberley's hands flew to her throat. "Died? Oh, no. But how?" "Poison," said Craddock grimly. "The same as Mr. Barstow." Mrs. Pemberley swayed slightly, gripping the armrest for support. "But that's impossible. I only wanted to comfort her. She was terrified. Oh, dear God." Miss Marple placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You gave her cocoa, didn't you, my dear? From your own tin." Mrs. Pemberley looked up sharply, her eyes filling with panic. "Yes, but it wasn't me. I never meant—" She broke off, trembling. Miss Marple's tone was soft, but her words were precise. "Perhaps not, but someone meant for it to seem so. Tell me, Mrs. Pemberley, did anyone else have access to your pantry that morning?" Mrs. Pemberley hesitated, then whispered, "Yes. Elsie Brent came early. She said she'd tidy before breakfast. I didn't think much of it." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The faithful housemaid, so often invisible, and yet so very clever when she chooses to be. Craddock blinked. "You mean Elsie?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave. "A woman who knows every cupboard, every habit, who sees what others ignore. She handled the tea things both nights, Inspector, and I fancy she found that little black notebook before anyone else." Mrs. Pemberley gasped. "But why would she—" "Because Henry Barstow kept more than money in that drawer," Miss Marple said softly. "He kept secrets, and secrets, Mrs. Pemberley, can be worth killing for." Outside, the bells of St. Mary's struck 6. The snow fell softly again, muffling the world. Miss Marple, walking home through the quiet street, felt the chill of revelation settle around her like frost. Another twist, yes, but the final pattern was still hidden beneath the snow. Elsie Brent, the timid housemaid, had played her part beautifully, too beautifully, and Miss Marple, tightening her shawl, knew the game was nearly done. The time for gentle observation was over. The time for truth had come. Snow fell more steadily now, whispering against the windows of St. Mary Mead, as if the heavens themselves conspired to smother the village in silence. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room the fire burned low, its amber glow casting long, thoughtful shadows on her lace curtains. She sat in her favorite armchair, knitting needles moving absently. Though her mind was far from the wool in her lap, she was thinking of holly. Not just any holly, of course, but the sprig that had adorned the late Mr. Latterly's front door wreath, now infamous after his untimely death. It was Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, who had first remarked on its curious scent. "Such a sharp, peculiar smell," she had said, wrinkling her nose. At the time, no one paid much heed, but Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime listening to what others dismissed as idle remarks, had felt the small tug of curiosity that so often led her toward truth. She laid her knitting aside and turned her gaze toward the window, where the snowflakes clung like lace to the glass. "A smell," she murmured softly. "A simple, silly little smell." Earlier that morning, the police had returned to the Latterly home, combing for overlooked evidence. Inspector Crail, red-faced and impatient, had announced that he expected an arrest before Christmas Eve. Everyone assumed he meant young Peter. Poor Peter Bryant, the curate, whose pale face and nervous stammer made him an easy target. But Miss Marple, recalling his gentle eyes and quiet sincerity, felt instinctively that Peter's conscience was too tender for poison. Poison. That was the word the inspector used, though the precise substance remained unconfirmed. The doctor's preliminary notes suggested something fast-acting and bitter. It was not arsenic, nor digitalis, nor any of the more familiar killers. Yet Miss Marple's mind, filled with memories of countless garden teas and whispered confessions, began to weave threads: poison in a festive drink, a scent in the holly, and a man found lifeless beneath a Christmas wreath. How neatly, how symbolically cruel it all was. A knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Mr. Pritchard, the postmaster, his nose red from the cold. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said cheerily. "Got a delivery from London, express post. Imagine that in this weather." He handed her a small brown parcel and left in a hurry, eager to return to his warm hearth. Miss Marple placed the parcel on her table, but her mind lingered on Mr. Pritchard's visit. "London," she murmured. Mr. Latterly's niece, Alice, had recently returned from London, had she not? A fashionable young woman with a penchant for mystery novels and perfumes. Perfumes. Again, that scent of holly came to mind. Too sharp, too chemical, not the sweet greenery of the season. She reached for her notebook, a simple thing bound in faded blue cloth, and turned to a fresh page. Her handwriting, fine and deliberate, traced thoughts like spider silk. Holly. Scent? Chemical? Alice. Perfume bottles. Expensive, imported. Peter. Innocent. Nervous. In love. Mrs. Weatherby. Gossip as shield. Dr. Fletcher. Too certain too soon. Stared at the last line for a moment. Dr. Fletcher had been unusually eager to declare the death a matter of tragic heart failure, until the discovery of the bitter residue in the teacup forced him to revise his opinion, an honest mistake, or an intentional one. Her reverie was broken by a knock once more, lighter this time, hesitant. When she opened the door, she found Alice herself, looking pale beneath her fashionable hat. "Miss Marple," she said, voice trembling. I didn't know who else to speak to." "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, ushering her toward the fire. "Sit down and warm yourself. You've had a dreadful few days." Alice's gloved hands twisted in her lap. "It's horrid. Everyone whispering. They think Uncle's money will come to me. That I had reason to do such a thing. But I swear I loved him. He was always kind." "I'm sure he was," Miss Marple said. "You know, people often speak out of fear. The village loves its stories, but truth rarely lies in the loudest voices." Alice gave a small, broken laugh. "You sound like you know everything already." "Not everything," Miss Marple smiled gently. "Only people." For a moment neither spoke. Then Alice reached into her handbag and withdrew a small glass vial, half empty, with a silver cap. "I found this among Uncle's things. It's my perfume. I must have left it there the last time I visited, but it smells different, somehow." Miss Marple took the vial, uncapped it, and inhaled delicately. Beneath the floral notes of jasmine lay something harsher, acrid. "Curious," she murmured. "Very curious indeed." Alice frowned. "What do you think it means?" "It means," Miss Marple said softly, "that someone wished a kind old man's death to seem almost accidental, and that they were clever enough to use the tools already at hand." Alice's eyes widened. "You think someone tampered with my perfume?" Miss Marple capped the bottle, her mind already dancing ahead. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is meant to look that way." She looked up at Alice, her expression kindly but searching. "Tell me, my dear, when you last visited your uncle, who else was there?" "Just Dr. Fletcher. He came to check on Uncle's heart, and Mrs. Weatherby stopped by later to bring the wreath she'd made." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Ah, the wreath again. That night, when Alice had gone and the fire burned low, Miss Marple sat long in thought. She imagined the holly wreath hanging proudly on the door, the sharp scent drifting through the cold air, the poison perfume mingling with it like a cruel harmony. She remembered, too, How Mrs. Weatherby had spoken of making that wreath by hand, a touch of something special this year, she had boasted, and how she'd been quick to point a trembling finger toward young Peter, her protests too rehearsed, her grief too performative. Miss Marple closed her notebook and whispered to the quiet room. It's always the little things that give one away. A wreath, a bottle, a smell. And as the clock struck midnight, the old lady smiled faintly to herself. The pattern was forming, still incomplete, but clear enough that the shape of truth began to glimmer beneath the snow. For in St. Mary Mead, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed, and evil often hid itself behind the prettiest of decorations. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a call on Mrs. Weatherby and bring with her, quite innocently, a small bouquet of holly. Morning broke with a deceptive calm over St. Mary Mead. The snow had ceased its quiet fall, leaving the village blanketed in white serenity. From every chimney rose slender threads of smoke, curling lazily into the pale winter sky. But beneath the tranquil surface, tension simmered. News of Miss Marple's visit to the Latterly house the previous evening had already begun its quiet circulation, passed from Mrs. Price to the butcher's wife, from the butcher's wife to young Tommy at the post, and from Tommy to Mrs. Weatherby herself. Mrs. Weatherby was not pleased. Her small sitting room was stiflingly warm, scented heavily with rosewater and coal smoke. She stood before the mirror, adjusting her dark morning hat, lips pressed tight. Her eyes, once bright with social curiosity, now flickered with unease. She had built her reputation in St. Mary Mead upon propriety, kindness, and gossip disguised as charity. But Miss Marple's quiet scrutiny unsettled her. There was something deeply unnerving about those pale blue eyes that seemed to see through one's words, to the trembling motives beneath. When the knock came, Mrs. Weatherby jumped despite herself. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, opening the door a moment later, voice too bright, too controlled. "My dear, what a surprise. Do come in. How very thoughtful of you to brave the cold." "Not at all, Lil," said Miss Marple pleasantly, stepping inside and shaking a dusting of snow from her coat. "I thought I might bring you a little cheer. Some holly from my garden. Such lovely red berries this year, don't you think?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking the small bouquet. "Oh, yes, very pretty indeed, though after recent events, I can scarcely look at the stuff without shivering." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Quite understandable. It's strange, isn't it, how objects so innocent in appearance can hold such heavy associations." They sat together by the fire, the older woman offering tea, her movements slightly stiff. The conversation began with harmless pleasantries. The weather, the church service, the upcoming Christmas luncheon. But Miss Marple's inquiries soon took a more delicate turn. "You must feel dreadful, my dear," she said softly, "to think that something you crafted so lovingly, the wreath, should become so infamous." Mrs. Weatherby's teacup rattled faintly on its saucer. "Indeed, Miss Marple, it's been quite distressing. But I assure you, I made that wreath exactly as I make all the others. Nothing unusual at all." "Oh, I'm sure," said Miss Marple, her tone mild. "And yet there was that peculiar scent, wasn't there? I remember you mentioning that you'd found a new polish for the holly leaves. Such a clever idea, to make them shine." Mrs. Weatherby blinked. "Polish?" "Yes," Miss Marple said innocently, sipping her tea. "Or was it something else you used? I may have misunderstood. I only recall you saying something about how a touch of spirits helps preserve the greenery." For a fleeting instant, panic flitted across Mrs. Weatherby's eyes. "Spirits? Oh, yes, just a little gin, to keep the holly from wilting. Old family trick, you know." Miss Marple set down her teacup with a soft click. "Ah, yes, old family tricks. One learns so many of those in small villages. doesn't one? Though it does make one wonder. If the scent was gin, why did Dr. Fletcher say it reminded him of chloroform? Silence fell, heavy as the snow outside. Mrs. Weatherby's knuckles whitened around her cup. Chloroform? Nonsense. Why would I ever? Why indeed? Miss Marple said quietly, "It's quite dangerous after all, but I've found that danger often slips into the homes of those who mean no harm, through bottles left uncorked or substances borrowed without thought. Sometimes, even through the kindness of helping a friend polish their leaves." Mrs. Weatherby looked away. Her voice trembled. I don't know what you mean." "Oh, but I think you do," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "You see, dear Mr. Latterly had recently discovered something about a certain fund at the parish. He told the curate he intended to have a word with the vicar after Christmas. You remember that fund, don't you? The one for the new church organ?" The older woman's face blanched. He said that?" "Not in so many words," Miss Marple continued softly. "But he was a tidy man, and I imagine he noticed when the accounts did not quite balance. Such little matters can make life awkward for those who like to be helpful with other people's money." Mrs. Weatherby rose suddenly, pacing the room. "You have no proof of any of this." "I did what I always do. I made a wreath, I brought it to his door, and I went home. That's all." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her voice calm. "Of course, my dear. And yet, it was a rather unusual wreath this year. You used white berries, didn't you? Quite rare. They only grow from the bushes in your back garden, the ones you keep locked behind that little gate." The woman froze, her lips parting. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You see, I had a look this morning while I passed by. Some of the leaves were quite scorched along the edges. A peculiar thing, that. It happens when one treats holly with a certain chemical, one that preserves it beautifully, but is terribly toxic if ingested." The silence stretched, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Then Mrs. Weatherby sank into her chair, all the brittle pride draining from her face. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I only wanted to frighten him, to stop him from saying anything before I could fix it. He wasn't supposed to drink the tea. I thought the fumes alone would make him dizzy." Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave but not cruel. "Yes, intentions are such slippery things. They start with fear or embarrassment and end, well, as they ended here." Tears spilled freely down the woman's cheeks now. "I meant to replace the wreath, but when I went back, he'd already fallen. I panicked. I said Peter must have done it. I thought if I kept quiet, it would all fade away." "Evil rarely fades when ignored," Miss Marple said softly. "It grows like ivy, creeping into every corner." Outside, a carriage could be heard stopping on the road, the heavy boots of Inspector Crail approaching the door. Miss Marple rose gently and laid a hand on the sobbing woman's shoulder. "I believe," she said quietly, "you've been expecting company." Mrs. Weatherby looked up, her face pale as the snow. "You told them?" "No," said Miss Marple, taking her shawl. "But I imagine they'll be very grateful you've decided to tell them yourself." As Miss Marple stepped out into the cold air, she glanced back once through the frosted window. Inside, the grand old lady of St. Mary Mead sat weeping among her roses and her wreaths, the holly berries gleaming blood-red in the dim light. Miss Marple's eyes softened with a quiet sorrow. "Such a pity," she murmured. "All that pride, all that secrecy, over a few missing pounds and a bit of reputation. People do the strangest things for fear of what others might think." The inspector tipped his hat as he passed her. "Evening, Miss Marple. Any advice before I go in?" She smiled faintly. "Only this, Inspector. Be gentle. It's Christmas, after all." And with that, she turned down the snowy lane, her small figure fading into the white hush of St. Mary Mead, where peace, at last, was beginning to return. Though Mrs. Weatherby's confession should have brought the matter to a close, something about it refused to settle in Miss Marple's mind. It was like a knot in her knitting, seemingly untangled, yet tugged strangely when she thought of it. The old lady had confessed through tears, yes, and her explanation of the poisoned wreath was plausible enough. But Miss Marple's instincts, honed through years of observing human frailty, told her that the pattern of deceit in St. Mary Mead was not yet fully revealed. That night, sleep eluded her. The fire crackled low, her cat purred at her feet, and the air smelled faintly of snow and candle wax. She sat upright, recalling every detail: Mrs. Weatherby's panic, the scent of the perfume, Alice's trembling hands, Dr. Fletcher's overeager pronouncements, and suddenly, in the quietest moment between the ticking of the clock, it came to her. The perfume. She rose swiftly for one her age, fetching the vial from the small drawer in her writing desk. Uncorking it once more, she inhaled carefully. Beneath the floral sweetness there lingered not only bitterness, but an earthy medicinal note. Chloroform, yes, but also something else. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah," she whispered, "that explains rather a lot." At dawn, she sent a note to Inspector Crail, asking him to delay any formal charges. She needed one more conversation, one more subtle test, and she knew precisely who must be invited to tea. By mid-morning, the snow had melted enough to allow a carriage to reach her gate. Dr. Fletcher stepped out, impeccably dressed, as always, though a faint anxiety lined his mouth. He was surprised, perhaps, that Miss Marple had summoned him so soon after the case seemed closed. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, removing his hat and gloves. "You sent for me, I must say. It's quite the relief that this dreadful affair is finally over." "Indeed," Miss Marple said with gentle courtesy, ushering him toward her sitting room. "Do sit down, Doctor. I've been baking. Scones with currants, if you please. I thought we might have a little chat before the season quite steals us away." He smiled, though his eyes flickered briefly toward the table, where the tea service gleamed in the firelight. "Always a pleasure," he said lightly. She poured him a cup, her hands steady. "I've been thinking a good deal about poor Mrs. Weatherby," she said, her tone almost wistful. "So very unfortunate, don't you think, that such a respectable lady should lose her head over a few missing pounds?" He nodded gravely. "Quite tragic. Still, it seems justice will be served. A pity it took such a dreadful means to uncover the truth." Miss Marple stirred her tea, looking down as though lost in thought. "You've been so very helpful to the investigation, Doctor, and such a comfort to the village. Everyone speaks highly of your composure." He inclined his head modestly. "One does what one can." "Yes," she said, almost absently. "One does." She let the silence stretch, then lifted her gaze with a faint smile. "Do you know, Doctor, I found something rather interesting about that perfume Alice brought me. I had it examined by a chemist I know from my nephew's days in London. That got his attention." His hand paused midway to his teacup. "Examined? My dear Miss Marple, was that necessary? Surely the matter is quite settled." "Oh, but curiosity is a dreadful habit of mine," she said, her voice light, almost teasing. "You see, the chemist found traces of a sedative compound. Not chloroform, precisely, but a medical derivative, quite rare. Something I believe only a physician would recognize." A brief flicker crossed Dr. Fletcher's eyes, quickly smothered, but there. Miss Marple watched it like a hawk hidden behind lace curtains. "I'm afraid I don't quite follow," he said carefully. "Oh, it puzzled me too at first. Miss Marple continued, her tone still mild, until I recalled that it wasn't Mrs. Weatherby who first mentioned the scent of chloroform. It was you. Rather odd, isn't it, for a man who'd supposedly detected nothing amiss during his examination of poor Mr. Latterly's body. The doctor's expression tightened. "Are you implying—" "Only observing," she interrupted, smiling sweetly. "You see, the holly wreath was quite genuine, and Mrs. Weatherby's tears even more so. But the poison, that came from another hand entirely. I believe someone tampered with the teacup after Mrs. Weatherby's visit. Someone who knew how to mask a fast-acting sedative with the faint bitterness of perfume and gin." His teacup trembled ever so slightly as he set it down. "Miss Marple, you're making very serious accusations." "Oh, not accusations, dear doctor, merely deductions." Her eyes softened, though her voice carried a steely undercurrent. "You see, Mr. Latterly had consulted you privately, hadn't he, about revising his will? The new document, which you yourself witnessed, would have left a generous bequest to your medical practice, provided he lived until Christmas Day. But if he were to die before then, that clause would expire." Dr. Fletcher's composure began to crack. "That's absurd. There's no proof of—" "Ah, but there is," Miss Marple said quietly. "You were careless enough to leave your prescription ledger open on your desk when Alice stopped by your surgery. She mentioned to me that she'd seen a curious entry, chloroform solution, ordered under Mr. Latterly's name, though he had no need for it. I imagine you thought she wouldn't notice." He rose abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "You can't possibly—" But Miss Marple did not move. Her knitting rested beside her teacup, half-finished, serene. "Oh, I never claim certainty, doctor. I leave that to the police. But I do know people, and I know that Mrs. Weatherby, poor soul, is no murderer. Foolish, perhaps, but not cunning enough to orchestrate such a layered deception. No, that requires someone practiced in the art of death, someone who could, with a single word, make a heart stop, or a village believe in an accident." The doctor's breath came shallow now, his eyes darting toward the door. But before he could speak, there came a firm knock, a rhythm precise as a heartbeat. Inspector Crail entered, his expression grave. "Ah," Miss Marple said mildly, glancing up. "I'm so glad you came, Inspector. I was just saying how remarkable it is that the medical certificate was signed before the post-mortem." The inspector's brows rose. "Before you say?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, folding her hands neatly, almost as if the good doctor anticipated the conclusion. Dr. Fletcher turned white as frost. "You scheming old—" But Crail's hand was already on his shoulder. "That's enough, doctor. Best come along quietly." When they were gone, Miss Marple sat back with a soft sigh. The fire hissed gently, the cat stretched, and the clock struck 11. She poured herself another cup of tea, murmuring to the empty room, "2 confessions, 1 truth. How very like humanity, to lie, even while believing one is honest." She thought of Mrs. Weatherby, sitting alone in her cottage, freed from guilt but not from shame. Of Alice, her innocence preserved by a stroke of luck. And of Dr. Fletcher, charming, respected, undone by greed and vanity. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's never the poison that shocks one," she said to herself. "It's the motive, always the motive." Outside, the snow began again, soft and slow, covering St. Mary Mead in a blanket of deceptive purity. Inside, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the rhythm steady and sure. Another crime unraveled, another truth revealed, quietly, gently, as only she could manage. And somewhere, far off in the village, the church bells began to ring for Christmas Eve, their sound mingling with the whisper of snow. A reminder that even amid deceit and death, There was still grace to be found in understanding the frail, curious hearts of men. Christmas Eve arrived in St. Mary Mead with the gentle hush of freshly fallen snow. The village seemed suspended in anticipation. Doors were shuttered, lights glowed warmly behind frosted panes, and the aroma of roasting meats and baked pies drifted through narrow lanes. To any casual observer, the village was blissfully ordinary, the earlier tragedies reduced to whispered gossip. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the festive veneer lay a web of secrets, petty fears, and calculated cruelty that had brought St. Mary Mead to the brink of disaster. Miss Marple decided it was time for the final gathering. She had invited the key players to her home under the pretense of a small Christmas tea. The fire burned brightly, casting gold and amber shadows across her sitting room. The cat, perching delicately on the windowsill, surveyed the scene with the air of a silent judge. Alice Latterly arrived first, carrying a bouquet of holly Miss Marple had asked her to bring. She looked pale but composed, her eyes wide with both curiosity and fear. Mrs. Weatherby followed, still trembling from her confession but relieved to have her name cleared. Finally, Dr. Fletcher entered, exuding a careful calm, although Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands as he removed his gloves. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle yet firm. "I asked you here because while St. Mary Mead can seem like a quiet village, even the smallest events can reveal extraordinary truths." She gestured toward the fire. "Do sit. Tea and scones await, though I hope the warmth will not only be in the kitchen." The room fell silent, each person watching her intently, sensing the unspoken weight in her words. Miss Marple picked up a holly sprig from the table and let her fingers trace the red berries. "Let us consider the unfortunate events of the past fortnight. First, the death of Mr. Henry Barstow, a kind, gentle man, taken suddenly and quietly, or so we thought. The initial investigation pointed to poison in his tea, administered by a hand believed to be innocent. And yet the method was clever, precise, and almost imperceptible, a type of cruelty only a practiced hand could execute." She paused, eyes flicking toward Dr. Fletcher. He shifted uneasily in his chair. Mrs. Weatherby confessed. Miss Marple continued. She made the wreath and intended no real harm. Her fear was of discovery, not of murder. Yet the death of Mr. Latterly, the so-called Christmas tragedy, followed a pattern that Mrs. Weatherby could not have orchestrated. Alice swallowed nervously. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "You see, it was not the wreath that killed. The wreath was a ruse, a tool to frighten and distract. The true method lay elsewhere. Something so subtle that only a person familiar with chemicals, with sedatives, and with the habits of the deceased could have carried it out. And that person, as I deduced, had knowledge not only of medicine, but also of human nature." She set the holly on the table, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Dr. Fletcher, when you examined Mr. Latterly, you were eager to rule his death accidental. Too eager, in fact. You left the door to your surgery unlocked, allowing young Alice to glimpse your ledger, wherein you had recorded a sedative compound ordered under Mr. Latterly's name." The doctor's jaw tightened, and his eyes darted toward the window. Miss Marple continued, her tone unwavering. "The chloroform derivative you prepared was carefully disguised. The bitterness, the faint scent, the mixing with perfumed tea and cocoa. These were your devices to make the deaths appear accidental, or at least unrelated. You counted on Mrs. Weatherby's naivety and Alice's inexperience to cover your tracks, and for a time, it worked." Dr. Fletcher's composure faltered. "This is preposterous. I was only ensuring Mr. Latterly's comfort. His heart was failing." "Comfort, doctor?" Miss Marple asked softly. "The dose in the tea was lethal. Only someone wishing Mr. Latterly's death could calculate such precision. You sought to inherit indirectly through his will. Your practice would have benefited greatly had he passed before the clause regarding bequests expired. Fear, greed, vanity, they are potent motivators, Doctor, and they can make even the most esteemed of men dangerous. He took a trembling step back. But no one could. Alice spoke quietly but firmly. You did it, didn't you? You made it look like an accident, so no one would suspect you. You killed my uncle for money. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, my dear, and everything was arranged to conceal your presence, to implicate others, to ensure that suspicion fell elsewhere. She gestured toward Mrs. Weatherby. Mrs. Weatherby's confession was genuine. Her fear, her panic were her own, but the hand that placed the poison in the cup, the hand that timed the servings, was yours. Dr. Fletcher's face was ashen. You have no proof? Proof? Miss Marple asked, tilting her head slightly. Sometimes proof is in the trembling of hands, the avoidance of eye contact, the small traces that others dismiss. A ledger carelessly left, a faint scent of sedative in a perfume bottle, a pattern repeated twice, once with Barstow, once with Latterly. Humans reveal themselves in the details, Doctor, if only one knows how to watch. He sank into a chair, unable to deny the quiet weight of her words. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock and the crackle of the fire. Inspector Crail, who had been summoned quietly during the conversation, stepped forward. Dr. Fletcher, I think it's best if you accompany us. There is a great deal to explain at the station. Fletcher looked at Miss Marple, eyes wide and pleading, but she merely nodded, her expression serene. It is done, Doctor. The truth is often far simpler than people imagine, though it takes patience to uncover. Alice exhaled, relief flooding her face. Oh, Miss Marple, thank you. Uncle's memory. It's safe now. Mrs. Weatherby dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, and I can finally rest, knowing I did not commit such a terrible crime after all. Miss Marple smiled softly. Yes, my dears, in St. Mary Mead, human nature will always provide its share of surprises. Greed, fear, and pride may cloud judgment, but with careful observation, the truth always reveals itself. Even amid the decorations and festivities, justice need not be forgotten. Alice laid the holly sprig gently on the mantelpiece. Outside, the first bells of Christmas chimed, their clear notes carrying across the snow-blanketed village. Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the fire, allowed herself a small, contented sigh. It had been a most intricate case, a tapestry of fear and deception, woven delicately among the village's most ordinary inhabitants. Yet once again she had seen through it all. The motives, the timing, the small inconsistencies, the hidden knowledge, everything pointed to a single, subtle hand guiding the events. She looked at the fire and whispered softly, as if to herself, "It is always in the details, always in the quiet observations, and sometimes in the smallest, sweetest of appearances." The village outside began to settle, the snow muffling footsteps, the roofs gleaming like white porcelain. Inside, Miss Marple's calm presence held the room, a gentle guardian of truth in a world where even a Christmas wreath could conceal deadly intent. The mystery was solved, the criminal caught, and St. Mary Mead could, at last, breathe freely again. Christmas morning arrived in St. Mary Mead with a quiet clarity. The snow, now settled into soft, glistening drifts, reflected the pale sunlight across the village lanes. Chimneys smoked lazily, and the aroma of baking bread, roasting meats, and spiced pies drifted through the crisp air. From the outside, life appeared ordinary, peaceful even. but within the hearts of the villagers. The events of the past fortnight had left their mark. Miss Marple sat in her armchair by the fire, knitting needles in hand, though her attention was on the view outside. The snow muffled all sounds, creating a fragile serenity over the village. Her cat, now curled into a perfect circle on the rug, purred softly. She sipped her tea, savoring the warmth, and reflected on the extraordinary quiet of St. Mary Mead. After so much commotion, Alice Latterly had already returned home with a sense of relief, unburdened by suspicion. Her uncle's legacy remained intact, and she could finally embrace the festive season without fear. Alice's hands had trembled when she brought Miss Marple the holly, but now they moved confidently, wrapping gifts with careful precision. The village had rallied around her, offering their quiet support and affection. It was a testament to human kindness, even in the face of deceit. Mrs. Weatherby, once trembling with guilt over her innocent misstep, now moved through her home with the cautious freedom of one whose name was cleared. She busied herself with cooking for the village children, offering small treats and sharing stories of past Christmases. Her eyes, once shadowed by panic, now held a warmth that seemed to mirror the flickering firelight of Miss Marple's sitting room. Yet, she could not shake the faint unease left by her role in the drama, the realization that fear and misjudgment can sometimes lead to devastating consequences. Inspector Crail, for his part, had returned to London with Dr. Fletcher in custody. The arrest had been discreet, carried out without scandal, but the implications rippled through the community. Even the most respected of villagers now understood that appearances could be deceptive. The doctor, once held in high esteem, would face justice for the crimes he had carefully masked. The thought left a quiet satisfaction in Miss Marple's mind. A man's own careful planning could not outwit the subtle observations of those who had patience and understanding on their side. Miss Marple herself had received quiet thanks from neighbors and friends alike, though she brushed aside any overt praise. To her, observation was not heroism. It was a lifelong practice of attentiveness, empathy, and understanding human nature. She had watched the subtleties, the twitch of an eye, the tremor of a hand, the faint scent of chemicals hidden beneath a familiar perfume. Through such observations, the truth had emerged, revealing the dark undercurrent beneath a seemingly ordinary Christmas. As she looked out at the village, Miss Marple thought of the lessons these events imparted. People are fragile, she reflected, but also resilient. Fear can drive individuals to irrational decisions, and greed can tempt even the most outwardly respectable. Yet beneath the flaws and follies, there exists a thread of integrity and kindness that, when noticed and nurtured, restores balance. St. Mary Mead had weathered not only the snow and winter chill, but also a brush with human cunning, and in its quiet way, it had endured. Later that afternoon, the villagers gathered for the small Christmas service at St. Mary's Church. Candles flickered against the stone walls, casting long, gentle shadows. Families sang carols, children whispered secret wishes, and neighbors exchanged greetings of goodwill. Miss Marple observed quietly from the back pew, her eyes sweeping the familiar faces. Each smile, each small gesture, reminded her that life's small pleasures often held more significance than the grandest schemes of wealth or influence. Alice approached Miss Marple after the service, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice tinged with gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't seen through it all." Miss Marple shook her head, smiling faintly. "You need only remember, my dear, that honesty and observation are often our best guides, and that fear, though powerful, can be tempered by courage and clarity of mind." The two women walked together through the snow toward Alice's home. exchanging quiet words about the village and its traditions. Even in the aftermath of tragedy, there was warmth in human connection, a continuity that no misdeed could entirely sever. Back in her own cottage, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire. The cat had shifted slightly, curling against her feet, while the tea in her cup cooled slowly. She pondered the intricacies of the recent case, the small signs overlooked by most, the missteps and assumptions of Dr. Fletcher, and the panic-driven actions of Mrs. Weatherby. Every detail, no matter how trivial it had seemed, had contributed to the resolution. She set her knitting aside and gazed thoughtfully into the fire. "People are such interesting creatures," she murmured to the empty room, "capable of such fear, such greed, but also such bravery and kindness. And if one watches carefully enough, the truth is always there, waiting to be noticed." Outside, the wind rustled through the bare branches of the trees, carrying the distant sound of laughter and song from the village. St. Mary Mead, nestled beneath its blanket of snow, had returned to its calm rhythm. Yet there remained, in the quietest corners, the memory of tension and suspicion, a reminder that beneath every serene facade, human nature can stir unpredictably. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, resuming the gentle rhythm of needle through wool. The case was concluded, the culprit caught, and the village restored to peace. Yet in her mind, the lessons lingered. To notice the small, to trust intuition tempered by observation, and to understand that human hearts, for all their frailty, carry within them the threads of both darkness and light. And so, as Christmas bells echoed faintly across the snow-laden streets of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple settled into her chair, content in the knowledge that once again, quiet vigilance had revealed the truth. Life, in its ordinary and extraordinary moments alike, continued, full of its gentle mysteries and subtle, enduring truths.